The winding road seemed to stretch endlessly into the night, its narrow path bordered by dense forests that loomed on either side like dark sentinels. The headlights of the car cut through the thickening mist, casting an eerie glow on the twisted trees and the occasional signpost that appeared out of the darkness. The silence was heavy, oppressive, broken only by the soft hum of the engine and the rhythmic thump of the tires against the cracked asphalt. Julie's grip tightened on the steering wheel as she squinted through the windshield, trying to make out the road ahead. It had been hours since she'd last seen another vehicle, and the isolation was beginning to wear on her. The road trip was supposed to be a chance to clear her head, to escape the chaos of her life for a few days, but now it felt like she was driving deeper into some forgotten corner of the world, a place where time and reality had begun to fray at the edges. She glanced at the clock on the dashboard. 2:17 a.m. The glowing numbers felt almost mocking, a reminder of how far she was from the comfort of daylight, from civilization. The GPS on her phone had stopped working miles ago, the signal lost in the wilderness, and now she was relying on instinct, following the road wherever it led. The map she'd picked up at the last gas station showed this route as a shortcut, a way to bypass the congested highways and reach her destination faster. But now, with the fog closing in and the road narrowing with each passing mile, Julie wondered if she'd made a mistake. She hadn't seen a sign for miles, hadn't passed a single town or even a farmhouse. Just endless trees, their branches twisting together above the road like a canopy of shadows. A flicker of movement caught her eye, and she instinctively pressed down on the brake. The car slowed to a crawl, the headlights sweeping over the forest's edge where she thought she'd seen something. A flash of white, a shadow darting between the trees. She waited, her heart pounding in her chest, but there was nothing. Just the stillness of the night, the fog swirling like ghostly tendrils across the road. Julie let out a breath. She didn't realize she'd been holding and eased her foot off the brake. The car crept forward, the tension in her muscles refusing to relax. She was just about to push the thought from her mind when she saw it again. A figure, standing in the middle of the road, illuminated by her headlights. Her breath caught in her throat as she slammed on the brakes, the car skidding to a halt. The figure didn't move, didn't flinch, just stood there, staring at her. It was a man, tall and thin, his face obscured by the shadow of a wide-brimmed hat. He wore an old-fashioned coat, the kind you'd see in a black and white movie, its hem fluttering slightly in the breeze. Julie's heart raced as she stared at the man, her mind racing with questions. Who was he? What was he doing out here in the middle of nowhere? And why wasn't he moving? She rolled down the window a few inches, just enough to call out, her voice shaky. "Hello? Are you okay?" The man didn't respond. He didn't even blink. He just stood there, his head tilted slightly as if studying her. A cold chill ran down Julie's spine, and she felt an overwhelming urge to turn the car around and drive as fast as she could in the opposite direction. But the road was narrow, barely wide enough for two cars to pass side by side, and she wasn't sure she could manage a U-turn without getting stuck in the ditch that ran alongside the road. "Do you need help?" she called again, louder this time. Still, the man didn't move. Julie's fingers drummed nervously on the steering wheel as she considered her options. She could try to drive around him, but the road was so narrow she'd have to pass within inches of him, and the thought of being that close to someone so unsettling made her skin crawl. Before she could make a decision, the man began to walk. He took slow, deliberate steps, moving to the side of the road, his eyes never leaving her. Julie watched him warily, her breath hitching as he came closer to the car, his face still hidden in shadow. As he reached the edge of the road, he stopped again, turning to face her. His eyes glinted in the darkness, catching the light from her headlights, and for a moment, Julie felt as if he could see straight through her, as if he knew every fear and doubt she had ever had. She didn't wait for him to do anything else. She hit the gas, the car lurching forward as the tires squealed against the pavement. The man didn't react, didn't move a muscle as she sped past him, her heart pounding in her chest like a drumbeat. Julie kept her foot on the gas, not daring to look in the rearview mirror, afraid of what she might see. The road twisted and turned, the trees closing in on either side, and she pushed the car faster, desperate to leave the man and the unnerving encounter behind. It wasn't until she'd driven several miles that she finally let herself breathe, her grip on the steering wheel loosening slightly. The fog was beginning to lift, the trees thinning out as the road began to climb. She could see the outline of a mountain ahead, the dark silhouette rising against the night sky. Relief washed over her as she realized she was leaving the dense forest behind, heading into more open terrain. Maybe there was a town up ahead, or at least a gas station where she could stop and get her bearings. She just needed to keep going, to put as much distance as possible between herself and whatever she had left behind. But as the road continued to climb, the fog growing thicker once more, Julie began to notice something strange. The road was no longer winding up the mountain, it was curving back on itself, twisting in a way that didn't make sense. She frowned, glancing at the dashboard to check the compass. But the needle was spinning wildly, as if it couldn't find true north. Panic fluttered in her chest as she realized that she had no idea where she was going. The road didn't seem to be leading anywhere. It was just looping back on itself, a never-ending spiral that pulled her deeper into the wilderness. She slowed the car, scanning the trees for any sign of a turnoff or a side road, but there was nothing. Just the endless, winding road and the thick fog that swallowed everything beyond the reach of her headlights. Julie's hands were trembling as she gripped the steering wheel, her mind racing with fear. She was lost, trapped on a road that seemed to have no end, no exit. The claustrophobia of the situation pressed down on her, the walls of the car feeling like a prison, the fog outside like a smothering blanket that cut her off from the rest of the world. She drove on, her eyes flicking nervously between the road and the clock, watching the minutes tick by as the night stretched on. The fog grew thicker, the road narrower, until she felt like she was driving through a tunnel with no light at the end. And then she saw it, the same figure standing in the middle of the road, just as before. Julie's breath caught in her throat as she slammed on the brakes, the car skidding to a halt. The man was there, the same wide-brimmed hat, the same old-fashioned coat, his face still obscured by shadow. He hadn't moved, hadn't changed at all. He was exactly as he had been the first time she'd seen him. Her heart pounded in her chest as she stared at the man, a sense of dread washing over her. This wasn't possible. She had driven miles since she'd last seen him. There was no way he could be here, standing in front of her again. But there he was, as real as the car beneath her, as real as the fog that pressed in on all sides. Julie felt a surge of panic, her mind screaming at her to turn the car around, to get out of there as fast as she could. But before she could move, the man began to walk toward her again, just as he had before, his steps slow and deliberate, his eyes fixed on her. She couldn't take it anymore. She threw the car into reverse, her foot slamming down on the gas pedal as the tires screeched against the pavement. The car shot backward, the man growing smaller in the distance. But the road behind her was just as narrow and winding as before, and she struggled to keep the car on the asphalt. As she rounded a bend, she glanced in the rearview mirror, and there he was again, standing in the middle of the road, watching her with those cold, unblinking eyes. Julie's heart was pounding so hard she thought it might burst. She kept driving, her hands shaking so badly she could barely hold the steering wheel, her mind racing with fear and confusion. How was this possible? How could the man be in front of her, no matter which direction she drove? It was as if the road itself was alive, twisting and bending to trap her, to keep her from escaping. There was no way out, no exit from this nightmare. The car jolted as she hit a pothole, the impact sending a shudder through her body. She tightened her grip on the wheel, her knuckles white, and forced herself to focus. She had to find a way out. She had to keep going, keep searching for a break in the road, for a way to escape this endless loop. But the road just kept winding, the fog growing thicker, the darkness pressing in on all sides. She could barely see the trees anymore, their shapes distorted and twisted by the mist. The only thing that seemed real was the man, always there, always waiting, no matter which way she turned. Julie felt tears prick at the corners of her eyes, a sob rising in her throat as the reality of her situation began to sink in. She was trapped, lost on a road that had no end, no exit. The fear was overwhelming, crushing her, making it hard to breathe. And then, just as she thought she couldn't take it anymore, she saw a light. It was faint, barely visible through the fog, but it was there. A soft, golden glow that flickered like a candle in the darkness. Hope surged in her chest as she steered the car toward the light, her heart pounding with a mixture of fear and anticipation. The light grew brighter as she approached, and soon she could see its source. A small, weathered building, barely more than a shack, sitting at the side of the road. A single lantern hung from a hook above the door, casting a warm, inviting glow over the rough wooden planks. Julie pulled the car to a stop, her hands shaking as she killed the engine. She sat there for a moment, staring at the shack, her mind racing with 1,000 questions. Who lived here in the middle of nowhere? Why was there a light on in the middle of the night? And most importantly, could this be her way out? She took a deep breath, trying to steady her nerves, and then reached for the door handle. The air was cold and damp as she stepped out of the car, her breath misting in the air as she walked slowly toward the shack. The wood creaked under her feet as she climbed the short set of steps to the door, the lantern swinging gently in the breeze. She hesitated for a moment, her hand hovering over the doorknob, before finally gathering the courage to turn it. The door swung open with a low groan, revealing a small, dimly lit room. The interior was simple, almost Spartan. A single table and chair, a small wood-burning stove in the corner, and shelves lined with jars and dusty books. The air was thick with the scent of burning wood and something else, something earthy and sweet that Julie couldn't quite place. She stepped inside, her eyes scanning the room for any sign of the person who lived here, but it was empty. The only sound was the crackling of the fire in the stove, the warmth of the flames a welcome relief from the cold outside. Julie's gaze was drawn to the table in the center of the room. A map was spread out across its surface, pinned down at the corners by small, polished stones. It was old, the edges frayed and yellowed with age, but she could make out the lines and markings of a road, winding through the forest. Her heart skipped a beat as she realized what she was looking at. It was the road she had been driving on, the same twisting, endless path that had trapped her in this nightmare. She leaned closer, her breath catching in her throat as she traced the route with her finger. The road looped back on itself, over and over, a never-ending spiral with no clear destination. But there was something else, something that made her blood run cold. At the center of the spiral, where all the loops converged, there was a mark, an X drawn in dark, bold strokes. It was faint, almost smudged, but it was there, a clear indication of something, of a place that the road was leading her to. Julie's mind raced with fear and confusion. What did it mean? Why was the X there? And who had drawn this map, left it here for her to find? She heard the door creak behind her, and her blood turned to ice. She whirled around, her heart pounding in her chest, and found herself face to face with the man from the road. He stood in the doorway, his wide-brimmed hat casting a shadow over his face, his eyes gleaming with an unnatural light. He didn't move, didn't speak, just stood there, watching her with an intensity that made her skin crawl. Julie backed away, her mind screaming at her to run, to get out of there, but her feet felt rooted to the spot. The man took a step forward, the floorboards creaking under his weight, and the door swung shut behind him with a final, ominous thud. The room seemed to close in around her, the walls pressing closer, the air growing thick and suffocating. Julie's breath came in short, panicked gasps as the man continued to advance, his eyes never leaving hers. There was no way out, no exit. She was trapped, caught in a nightmare from which there was no escape. The man reached the table, his gloved hand brushing against the edge of the map. He looked down at it, his gaze lingering on the X at the center of the spiral, and then he looked back up at her, his eyes cold and unfeeling. "You can't leave," he said, his voice low and gravelly, each word sending a shiver down her spine. "There's no exit." Julie's vision swam with fear, the room tilting and spinning around her as the reality of her situation crashed over her like a wave. There was no escape. She was trapped, lost in a labyrinth of twisted roads and suffocating fog, with no way out. The man took another step forward, and the world went black. Julie awoke to the sound of her own ragged breathing, her body drenched in sweat, her heart pounding in her chest. She was lying on the floor of the shack, the rough wood pressing against her cheek, the room spinning around her. She pushed herself up onto her hands and knees, her head throbbing with pain, and looked around. The shack was empty. The man was gone, the map was gone, and the only sound was the crackling of the fire in the stove. For a moment, she wondered if it had all been a dream, a nightmare born of exhaustion and fear. But the memory of the man's eyes, the way they had looked at her with such cold, calculating intent, was too vivid, too real. She staggered to her feet, her legs trembling beneath her, and stumbled toward the door. The air outside was cold and damp, the fog thick and impenetrable, but she didn't care. She had to get out, had to find a way to escape this nightmare. Julie ran to the car, her breath coming in short, panicked gasps as she fumbled with the keys. She shoved them into the ignition, her hands shaking so badly she could barely turn them, and the engine roared to life. She didn't look back as she sped away from the shack, the tires skidding on the wet pavement as she raced down the road. The fog closed in around her, the darkness pressing in on all sides, but she kept driving, her eyes fixed on the road ahead, praying for a way out. The road twisted and turned, the trees looming like dark sentinels on either side, and she drove faster, the car skidding around each bend, her heart pounding with fear and desperation. And then, just as she thought she might drive off the edge of the earth, she saw it. A light, faint and flickering, but there, cutting through the darkness like a beacon. She slowed the car, her breath hitching in her throat as she strained to see through the fog. The light grew brighter, and soon she could make out its source. A small gas station, its neon sign glowing like a lifeline in the night. Julie's heart soared with relief as she pulled into the lot, the car skidding to a halt in front of the pump. She shut off the engine, her hands still shaking, and sat there for a moment, her breath coming in ragged gasps. She had made it. She was out. But as she looked around, her relief quickly turned to dread. The gas station was old, its windows dark and empty, the pumps rusted and covered in peeling paint. There was no sign of life, no sign of anyone who might be able to help her. Just the silent, deserted lot, and the oppressive weight of the fog pressing in on all sides. Julie's hands trembled as she reached for the door handle, her heart pounding with a mixture of fear and anticipation. She had to get out of the car, had to find someone, anyone who could tell her where she was, how to get out of this nightmare. She stepped out of the car, the cold air biting into her skin, and walked slowly toward the gas station. The neon sign flickered above her, casting an eerie, sickly glow over the lot, and she shivered as she approached the door. The glass was cracked and dirty, the interior dark and foreboding. She hesitated, her hand hovering over the doorknob, before finally gathering the courage to push it open. The door creaked on its hinges, the sound echoing in the empty space, and Julie stepped inside, her breath misting in the cold air. The interior was dark, the shelves bare, the floor covered in a layer of dust. It was clear that no one had been here for a long time. Julie's heart sank as she realized that she was alone, that there was no one here who could help her. She was trapped, lost in a nightmare from which there was no escape. And then she saw it, a map pinned to the wall behind the counter. Her breath caught in her throat as she walked slowly toward it, her eyes scanning the lines and markings, the twisted, looping roads that seemed to go on forever. It was the same map she had seen in the shack, the same spiral with the X at its center. Her hands trembled as she reached out to touch it, her fingers tracing the lines of the road, the same road she had been driving on for what felt like an eternity. There was no exit, no way out. Julie's vision blurred with tears, her mind racing with fear and despair. She was trapped, lost in a labyrinth of twisted roads and suffocating fog, with no way out. And then she heard it, the sound of footsteps, slow and deliberate, echoing through the empty gas station. She turned, her heart pounding in her chest, and saw the man from the road standing in the doorway, his eyes gleaming with an unnatural light. "You can't leave," he said, his voice low and gravelly, each word sending a shiver down her spine. "There's no exit." Julie's vision swam with fear, the room tilting and spinning around her as the reality of her situation crashed over her like a wave. There was no escape. She was trapped, caught in a nightmare from which there was no exit. The man took a step forward, his eyes never leaving hers, and the world went black. When Julie awoke, she was lying in her car, the engine running, the fog pressing in on all sides. She sat up, her head throbbing with pain, and looked around, her heart pounding with fear and confusion. She was back on the road, the same twisting, endless road that had trapped her in this nightmare. The man was gone, the gas station was gone, and the only sound was the soft hum of the engine and the rhythmic thump of the tires against the cracked asphalt. There was no exit, no way out. Julie's hands trembled as she gripped the steering wheel, her mind racing with fear and despair. She was trapped, lost in a labyrinth of twisted roads and suffocating fog, with no way out. And as she drove on, the road twisting and turning, the fog growing thicker, she knew that she would never escape this nightmare. There was no exit. There never had been. The small town of Crescent Hollow was nestled deep in the Appalachian Mountains, a quiet, unassuming place where time seemed to move slower. The townsfolk were friendly, life was simple, and the community was tight-knit. But beneath the tranquil surface, Crescent Hollow harbored a chilling secret, one that had haunted its residents for generations. It was called the Vanishing Hour. Every year, on the night of the autumn equinox, precisely at midnight, someone from the town would vanish without a trace. There were no signs of struggle, no clues, nothing to explain the mysterious disappearances. The townspeople lived in fear of that fateful night, praying they wouldn't be the next to disappear. For Claire Bennett, Crescent Hollow had always been home. She grew up hearing the stories, the whispers of the vanishing hour that plagued the town every autumn. Her parents had warned her to stay indoors on that night, to avoid the forest at all costs. But Claire was a curious soul, and the mystery of the vanishing hour fascinated her. She had always wanted to uncover the truth, to find out what really happened to those who vanished. As the autumn equinox approached, the town was gripped by a palpable sense of dread. Claire, now in her 20s and an aspiring journalist, decided it was time to investigate the phenomenon that had haunted her town for so long. Armed with her notebook, camera, and a determination to find the truth, she set out to interview the families of those who had vanished over the years. Her first stop was the home of Mrs. Abernathy, an elderly woman whose husband had disappeared during the vanishing hour 50 years ago. Mrs. Abernathy was hesitant to talk at first, but Claire's genuine curiosity and empathy won her over. The old woman recounted the night her husband vanished, her voice trembling with emotion. "He went out to check on the livestock," Mrs. Abernathy said, her eyes distant. "He never came back. We searched the entire property, the woods, everywhere. There wasn't a single trace of him. It's like he just disappeared." Claire noted every detail, her mind racing with possibilities. She visited several other families, each with similar stories of loved ones who had vanished without a trace. The more she learned, the more determined she became to uncover the truth. There had to be a pattern, a reason behind the disappearances. As the equinox drew nearer, Claire decided to visit the town's library, hoping to find historical records or documents that might shed light on the mystery. The library was a dusty, old building filled with ancient books and forgotten records. She spent hours poring over old newspapers, journals, and town records, piecing together the history of the vanishing hour. One entry in an old journal caught her attention. It was written by a man named Samuel Carter, who had lived in Crescent Hollow in the early 1800s. Samuel described a series of strange events leading up to the vanishing hour. Unexplained lights in the sky, eerie sounds emanating from the forest, and a sense of foreboding that hung over the town. Samuel's journal detailed a legend that had been passed down through generations. According to the legend, Crescent Hollow was built on ancient, sacred ground, a place where the boundaries between worlds were thin. On the night of the autumn equinox, the veil between the living and the dead would lift, allowing spirits to cross over. Those who vanished during the vanishing hour were believed to be taken by these spirits, trapped in a realm beyond time. Intrigued and a little frightened, Claire knew she had to see it for herself. She decided to spend the night of the equinox in the woods, near the spot where most of the disappearances had occurred. She set up her camera and prepared to document whatever happened. As the clock struck midnight, she felt a chill in the air, and the forest grew eerily silent. Suddenly, a soft, otherworldly light appeared in the distance. Claire's heart pounded as she crept closer, her camera capturing every moment. The light grew brighter, and she could hear faint whispers, like voices calling out from another world. She felt a strange pull, an irresistible urge to step into the light. But she resisted, reminding herself of the danger. Just as quickly as it had appeared, the light vanished, leaving Claire alone in the dark forest. She felt a wave of relief and disappointment wash over her. She hadn't found the answers she was looking for, but she had witnessed something extraordinary. Determined to continue her investigation, she packed up her equipment and headed back to town. The next morning, Claire reviewed the footage she had captured. Her heart skipped a beat as she saw the eerie light and heard the whispers. She knew she was onto something, but she needed more information. She decided to visit Professor Henry Whitmore, a retired historian who had studied the legends of Crescent Hollow for decades. Professor Whitmore was a kind, elderly man with a wealth of knowledge about the town's history. He listened intently as Claire recounted her experience, his eyes widening with interest. "I've heard of such phenomena," he said, stroking his beard thoughtfully. "It is believed that certain places have a natural energy that can create a portal between worlds. Crescent Hollow might be one of those places." He showed Claire an old map of the area, pointing out several locations where similar disappearances had occurred. "These places form a pattern," he explained. "A pentagram, to be exact. It's an ancient symbol often associated with rituals and the supernatural. If we can find the center of this pentagram, we might uncover the source of the vanishing hour." Claire and Professor Whitmore spent the next few days analyzing the map and pinpointing the center of the pentagram. It led them to a clearing deep in the forest, a place that felt both sacred and foreboding. The professor warned Claire of the dangers, but she was resolute. She needed to know the truth. On the night of the next equinox, Claire and Professor Whitmore returned to the clearing, equipped with cameras, recording devices, and protective charms. As midnight approached, the air grew cold, and an unnatural silence enveloped the forest. The ground beneath their feet seemed to vibrate with energy. At the stroke of midnight, the clearing was bathed in a brilliant, ethereal light. Claire and the professor stood their ground, their eyes fixed on the center of the clearing. Slowly, figures began to emerge from the light, ghostly apparitions of those who had vanished over the years. Claire recognized some of the faces from the photographs she had seen, including Mrs. Abernathy's husband. The apparitions moved towards Claire and Professor Whitmore, their expressions a mixture of sorrow and longing. One of them, a young girl with hollow eyes, reached out to Claire. "Help us," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "We are trapped." Claire's heart ached for the lost souls. She turned to Professor Whitmore, who was furiously scribbling notes. "What do we do?" she asked, her voice trembling. "We need to perform a ritual to close the portal and release their spirits," the professor replied. He handed Claire an ancient book filled with spells and incantations. "Follow my lead." Together, they began to chant, their voices steady and strong. The light in the clearing pulsed and flickered, and the apparitions seemed to respond, their forms growing more solid. Claire felt a surge of hope as she continued the incantation, her eyes locked on the young girl's face. As the ritual progressed, the ground beneath them trembled, and the air was filled with a deafening roar. The light intensified, and the apparitions began to fade, their expressions of sorrow replaced with peace. With a final, resounding chant, the light exploded in a burst of energy, and the clearing was plunged into darkness. Claire and Professor Whitmore stood in stunned silence, their breath coming in ragged gasps. The portal was closed, and the spirits were finally free. They had done it. They had broken the curse of the Vanishing Hour. In the days that followed, the town of Crescent Hollow was filled with a sense of relief and gratitude. The disappearances had stopped, and the townspeople could finally live without fear. Claire's investigation and bravery were celebrated, and her story was published in newspapers across the country. But for Claire, the experience was more than just a story. It was a journey of discovery, a test of courage, and a reminder of the power of the unknown. She continued her work as a journalist, always seeking the truth, always ready to face the mysteries that lay hidden in the shadows. Years later, Claire would return to Crescent Hollow, drawn back by the memory of that fateful night. She would stand in the clearing, now overgrown with wildflowers, and remember the faces of the lost souls she had helped to free. And she would know, deep in her heart, that some mysteries were meant to be solved, while others were meant to remain in the realm of the unknown. But she also knew that the Vanishing Hour, with all its terror and wonder, had given her a gift. The gift of understanding that the world was far more mysterious and magical than she had ever imagined. And with that knowledge, she would continue to seek the truth, no matter where it led her, for the rest of her days. Years passed since Claire Bennett and Professor Whitmore had broken the curse of the Vanishing Hour. The town of Crescent Hollow had returned to its serene existence, and the legends of mysterious disappearances became just that, legends. Claire had moved on to pursue other stories, her name becoming synonymous with uncovering the truth behind the supernatural. One autumn evening, as the sun set over the tranquil town, Claire received an unexpected visitor. A young man named Daniel arrived at her doorstep, his face etched with worry and desperation. "Ms. Bennett, I need your help," he pleaded. "My sister has gone missing." Claire's heart sank as she listened to Daniel's story. His sister, Emily, had vanished without a trace 2 nights ago, during the autumn equinox. Despite the previous success in closing the portal, it seemed that the Vanishing Hour had returned. Determined to help, Claire agreed to accompany Daniel back to Crescent Hollow. As they drove through the winding mountain roads, Claire's mind raced with questions. How could the curse have returned? What had they missed? Upon arriving in Crescent Hollow, they met with Professor Whitmore, who was equally puzzled and concerned. The trio decided to retrace their steps, starting with the clearing in the forest. The forest was as eerie as ever, the trees casting long shadows in the fading light. They reached the clearing, which was now covered in a blanket of fallen leaves. As they stood in the center, a familiar chill ran down Claire's spine. She knew they were on the right path but needed more information. They decided to visit Mrs. Abernathy again, hoping she might have insights into the recent events. The old woman welcomed them warmly, though her eyes were filled with sadness. She confirmed that she had felt a shift in the atmosphere, a resurgence of the old fear that had gripped the town for generations. Mrs. Abernathy handed Claire an old locket that had belonged to her husband. Inside was a tiny, folded piece of paper with a map and a cryptic note. The note read, "The source lies deeper than we knew." Intrigued, Claire and her companions examined the map, which pointed to a cave system hidden in the mountains. The next day, they set out for the caves, armed with flashlights and climbing gear. The entrance to the cave was hidden behind a thicket of brambles, almost as if nature itself wanted to keep it secret. They carefully made their way inside, the air growing colder and damper with each step. The cave was a labyrinth of narrow passageways and vast chambers, the walls glistening with moisture. As they ventured deeper, they discovered ancient symbols carved into the rock, similar to those they had seen in Samuel Carter's journal. It was clear they were on the right track. In the deepest chamber, they found an altar surrounded by a circle of stones. The altar was covered in dark stains, and the air was thick with an oppressive energy. Professor Whitmore examined the symbols and deduced that this was the true source of the curse, a place where dark rituals had been performed for centuries. Determined to end the curse once and for all, they prepared for another ritual. This time, they would need to destroy the altar and the stones, breaking the connection between the two worlds. As midnight approached, they began the incantations, their voices echoing through the cavern. The ground beneath them shook, and a blinding light filled the chamber. Ghostly figures emerged from the shadows, their faces twisted in anguish. Claire and her companions continued the ritual, their determination unwavering. The light intensified, and the figures began to fade, their expressions of torment replaced with peace. With a final, deafening roar, the altar shattered, and the cavern was plunged into darkness. The oppressive energy lifted, replaced by a profound sense of calm. Claire and her companions stood in silence, their breath coming in ragged gasps. They had done it, they had finally broken the curse. As they made their way back to the surface, the first rays of dawn pierced the darkness. The forest, once eerie and foreboding, now felt like a place of peace and renewal. They returned to Crescent Hollow, where they were greeted with relief and gratitude. Emily was found near the edge of the forest, unconscious but unharmed. She had no memory of what had happened, but Claire knew that the curse had finally been lifted. The town could now move forward, free from the fear that had haunted them for so long. In the weeks that followed, Claire wrote an extensive article about their experience, detailing the history of the Vanishing Hour and their journey to break the curse. The story captivated readers around the world, solidifying Claire's reputation as a fearless journalist and investigator of the supernatural. Years later, Claire would often return to Crescent Hollow, drawn back by the memory of those fateful nights. She would visit the clearing and the cave, now peaceful and quiet, and reflect on the mysteries she had unraveled. And she would know, deep in her heart, that some mysteries were meant to be solved, while others were meant to remain in the realm of the unknown. But she also knew that the Vanishing Hour had given her a gift, the gift of understanding that the world was far more mysterious and magical than she had ever imagined. And with that knowledge, she would continue to seek the truth, no matter where it led her, for the rest of her days. Years passed, and Claire's work continued to bring her to the farthest corners of the world. She had become a renowned figure in the field of paranormal journalism, often invited to speak at conferences and universities. Yet, despite all her success, the events in Crescent Hollow remained her most profound and personal experience. One autumn evening, Claire received a letter from a small village in Ireland. The letter spoke of mysterious disappearances occurring on the night of the autumn equinox, eerily similar to the Vanishing Hour. Intrigued and feeling a sense of duty, Claire decided to investigate. Upon arriving in the village of Dunmore, Claire was greeted by Father O'Connor, the local priest who had written the letter. He explained that 3 people had vanished over the past 3 years, each on the night of the equinox. The villagers were terrified, fearing that a dark force was at work. Father O'Connor took Claire to an ancient stone circle on the outskirts of the village. The circle was steeped in history, with legends of druids and ancient rituals. Claire felt a familiar chill as she approached the stones, sensing the presence of something otherworldly. As she examined the stones, Claire noticed carvings similar to those she had seen in Crescent Hollow. She realized that the stone circle was a powerful focal point for supernatural energy, and it was likely the source of the disappearances. Determined to prevent another vanishing, Claire and Father O'Connor decided to perform a ritual to cleanse the circle of its dark energy. They gathered the necessary supplies and enlisted the help of the villagers, who were eager to see an end to the terror. On the night of the autumn equinox, Claire, Father O'Connor, and the villagers gathered at the stone circle. The air was thick with tension, and the wind howled through the trees. As midnight approached, they began the ritual, their voices rising in a powerful chant. The ground beneath them trembled, and the stones seemed to pulse with energy. A blinding light filled the circle, and ghostly figures emerged from the shadows. Claire and the villagers held their ground, their determination unwavering. With a final, resounding chant, the light exploded in a burst of energy, and the figures began to fade. The ground stopped shaking, and a profound sense of peace settled over the stone circle. They had done it, they had broken the curse. The villagers celebrated their victory, grateful to Claire for her bravery and expertise. Father O'Connor expressed his heartfelt thanks, knowing that the village was finally free from the dark force that had plagued them. As Claire prepared to leave Dunmore, she reflected on the journey that had brought her here. The Vanishing Hour, with all its terror and wonder, had given her the gift of understanding the mysteries of the world. And with that knowledge, she knew she would continue to seek the truth, no matter where it led her. Claire's work took her to many more places, each with its own mysteries and challenges. She faced the unknown with courage and determination, always ready to uncover the truth. And though the world remained full of secrets, Claire knew that some mysteries were meant to be solved, while others were meant to remain in the realm of the unknown. But through it all, Claire never forgot the lessons she had learned in Crescent Hollow and Dunmore. She understood that the world was far more mysterious and magical than she had ever imagined. And with that knowledge, she continued to seek the truth, ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead for the rest of her days. When Emily Harper inherited her grandmother's old Victorian house, she thought it would be the perfect escape from the city. Nestled in a small town in upstate New York, the house had stood for over a century, its ornate architecture and sprawling gardens a testament to a bygone era. Emily had spent many summers there as a child, playing hide and seek in its maze of rooms, climbing the massive oak tree in the backyard, and listening to her grandmother's stories about the house's history. But now, as an adult, the house felt different. There was an air of neglect about it. The paint peeling from the walls, the garden overgrown with weeds, and the windows clouded with dust. The floors creaked underfoot as she walked through the halls, and the once bright and welcoming rooms now seemed dark and foreboding. It was as if the house had been holding its breath, waiting for her to return. Emily had always been close to her grandmother, and her passing had left a void in her life that she wasn't sure how to fill. Moving into the house felt like a way to stay connected to her, to preserve her memory. But as she settled into her new home, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. It was the little things at first. A door that wouldn't stay closed, a cold draft that seemed to come from nowhere, the faint sound of footsteps in the hall when she was alone. She told herself it was just the house settling, that old buildings like this had their quirks. But the unease lingered, growing stronger with each passing day. The nights were the worst. The house seemed to come alive after dark. The creaks and groans of the old would echoing through the empty rooms, the shadows stretching and shifting in the corners of her vision. It was on one of these restless nights that Emily first heard it, the faint, rhythmic tapping coming from beneath the floorboards in her bedroom. At first, she thought it was just the house settling, the wood contracting as the temperature dropped. But the tapping continued, a steady, insistent sound that seemed to grow louder the longer she lay there, listening. She tried to ignore it, pulling the covers up over her head and squeezing her eyes shut. But the sound persisted, drilling into her consciousness until she couldn't stand it anymore. She threw back the covers and climbed out of bed, her bare feet cold against the wooden floor as she crept across the room. The tapping stopped as soon as she stood up, leaving the room in an oppressive silence. Emily hesitated, her heart pounding in her chest as she stared down at the floorboards. She half expected the sound to start up again, but the house remained still, the only noise the faint rustling of the wind outside. Feeling foolish, Emily shook her head and turned back to bed. But just as she was about to climb under the covers, the tapping started again, louder this time, more insistent. It was coming from directly beneath her bed, as if someone or something was knocking from below. She froze, her breath catching in her throat as a cold shiver ran down her spine. Her mind raced with possibilities, each one more terrifying than the last. What could be under the floorboards? A trapped animal? Pipes knocking together? Or something else, something far more sinister? Emily tried to convince herself it was nothing, just the old house playing tricks on her. But the sound was so deliberate, so persistent, that she couldn't shake the feeling that it was a signal, a message meant for her. She grabbed the flashlight from her nightstand and knelt down beside the bed, her hands trembling as she pressed her ear to the floor. The wood was cold against her skin, and for a moment, all she could hear was the pounding of her own heart. But then the tapping came again, muffled and distant, as if it were coming from deep within the earth. Emily's stomach churned with unease as she ran her fingers over the floorboards, searching for any sign of movement, any hint of what lay beneath. The boards were old, worn smooth by years of use, but as she pressed down on one of them, she felt it give slightly under her touch. Her breath quickened as she pressed harder, the board creaking as it shifted beneath her weight. She grabbed the edge with her fingernails and pulled, the wood groaning in protest as she pried it loose. The board came up with a sharp crack, revealing a dark, narrow space beneath the floor. Emily shone her flashlight into the hole, the beam cutting through the darkness to reveal a small, cramped crawl space. The air was thick with dust and the musty smell of old wood, the walls lined with cobwebs that glistened in the light. But it was what lay in the center of the space that caught her attention. A small, ornate wooden box, its surface covered in intricate carvings that seemed to shimmer in the light. Her heart pounded in her chest as she reached into the hole, her fingers brushing against the cool, smooth surface of the box. It was heavier than she expected, the wood dense and solid, the lid secured with a small, rusted lock. Emily lifted the box out of the hole and set it on the floor beside her, her hands shaking as she examined it. The carvings were beautiful, intricate patterns that seemed to dance across the wood, but there was something unsettling about them, something that made her skin crawl. She tried to open the box, but the lock held fast, the metal cold and unyielding under her fingers. Frustrated, she set it aside and shone her flashlight back into the crawl space, searching for any other clues. But the space was empty, the only thing of note the small, perfectly square patch of earth where the box had been buried. As she stared down into the darkness, a wave of dizziness washed over her, the room spinning as a strange, overwhelming sense of déjà vu gripped her. She felt as if she had been here before, crouched on the floor in the middle of the night, her hands covered in dust and dirt, her heart pounding with a fear she couldn't name. She shook her head, trying to clear the fog from her mind, and closed the hole in the floor. She set the board back in place and climbed back into bed, the box tucked safely under her arm. But sleep didn't come easily that night, her mind racing with questions, with the sound of that infernal tapping echoing in her ears. The next morning, Emily awoke with a start, her body drenched in sweat, her heart pounding in her chest. She lay still for a moment, her mind foggy with sleep, trying to make sense of the strange, disjointed images that flickered in her memory. Dark corridors, locked doors, a voice whispering her name. She shook her head, pushing the thoughts aside as she climbed out of bed and set the box on the dresser. The sunlight streaming through the window did little to dispel the unease that clung to her, the memories of the night before lingering like a shadow at the edge of her consciousness. She spent the morning trying to distract herself, cleaning the house, sorting through the boxes of her grandmother's belongings that were still stacked in the living room. But the box was always there, sitting on the dresser, its presence a constant reminder of the secrets buried beneath the floorboards. By midday, she couldn't take it anymore. She had to know what was inside. She searched the house for something to break the lock, finally settling on a small hammer she found in the garage. The metal was old and rusted, the lock stiff with age, but after a few sharp taps, it gave way, the lid popping open with a soft click. Emily held her breath as she lifted the lid, the hinges creaking in protest. Inside, nestled among layers of old, yellowed paper, was a small bundle of letters, their edges frayed and worn, the ink faded with time. Her heart skipped a beat as she reached for the top letter, her fingers trembling as she unfolded the delicate paper. The handwriting was neat, precise, the words flowing across the page with an elegance that spoke of another era. My dearest Margaret, I cannot begin to express the depth of my sorrow at the thought of leaving you, but I fear I have no choice. The secrets I have uncovered are too dangerous, too powerful to be left in the hands of men like us. They must be hidden, buried where no one can find them. I have done my best to protect you, to keep you safe from the darkness that follows me. But I fear it is only a matter of time before it catches up with me, before it finds us. And when that day comes, you must promise me that you will leave this place, that you will not look back. There are things in this world that we are not meant to understand. forces that should never be unleashed. I only hope that by hiding this knowledge, I can spare you from the fate that awaits me. Asterisk. Yours always, Edward. Emily stared at the letter, her mind racing with questions. Who was Edward? And what were the secrets he spoke of? She flipped through the rest of the letters, each one more cryptic than the last, each one hinting at a mystery that seemed to go far beyond anything she had ever imagined. The last letter was different from the others, the handwriting more frantic, the ink smeared as if it had been written in haste. My dearest Margaret, asterisk, I fear this may be my last letter to you. The darkness has found me. I can feel it closing in, tightening its grip with each passing day. I have done my best to hide the truth, to protect you from what is coming, but I fear it may not be enough. Asterisk. Asterisk, if you are reading this, then I am gone, and the darkness is now yours to bear. But you must not let it consume you. You must find the strength to resist, to fight back. There is still hope, but it lies buried beneath the floorboards, hidden where only you can find it. Asterisk. Asterisk, do not trust anyone, not even those closest to you. The darkness can take many forms, wear many faces, but you must remain vigilant. You must uncover the truth no matter the cost. Asterisk. Yours eternally, Edward. Emily's hands trembled as she set the letter down, her heart pounding in her chest. The words seemed to echo in her mind. A warning, a plea for help from beyond the grave. But what did it all mean? And what was Edward trying to protect her grandmother from? She spent the rest of the day in a daze, her thoughts consumed by the letters, by the secrets they hinted at. She tried to push the thoughts aside, to focus on the mundane tasks of everyday life, but the weight of the mystery pressed down on her, refusing to be ignored. That night, as she lay in bed, the tapping started again. It was faint at first, barely audible over the sound of the wind outside, but as the night wore on, it grew louder, more insistent, as if something or someone was trying to get her attention. Emily threw back the covers and climbed out of bed, her heart pounding in her chest as she knelt beside the bed, her ear pressed to the floor. The sound was clearer now, a rhythmic tapping that seemed to be coming from deep within the earth, as if something was trying to dig its way out. She grabbed the flashlight from her nightstand and pried up the floorboard again, her hands trembling as she shone the light into the hole. The crawl space was empty, the small patch of earth where the box had been buried undisturbed. But the tapping continued, growing louder, more frantic, as if whatever was beneath the floorboards was desperate to be found. Emily hesitated for a moment, her mind racing with fear and uncertainty. But the need to know, to uncover the truth, was too strong to resist. She grabbed a small shovel from the garage and began to dig, the cold earth yielding easily beneath her hands. The hole grew deeper, the air thick with the scent of damp earth and decay. The tapping grew louder, more frantic, until it seemed to echo in her very bones. And then, with a final, sharp crack, her shovel hit something solid. Emily's heart skipped a beat as she dropped to her knees, her hands scrabbling in the dirt as she uncovered the object. It was another box, larger than the first, its surface covered in the same intricate carvings. Her breath quickened as she pried open the lid, the rusted hinges giving way with a creak. Inside, nestled among layers of old, rotting fabric, was a small, leather-bound book. Emily lifted the book from the box, her fingers trembling as she opened it. The pages were old, the paper brittle with age, but the writing was still legible, the ink dark and bold. The Journal of Edward Blackwood. Her heart raced as she flipped through the pages, her eyes scanning the words, the strange symbols that filled the margins. The journal was filled with detailed accounts of rituals, of dark magic and forbidden knowledge, of encounters with entities that defied explanation. But it was the final entry that sent a chill down her spine. Asterisk, the darkness is here. It has found me. I have done everything I can to protect the truth, to hide it where no one can find it. But I fear it may not be enough. Asterisk. Asterisk, I can feel it closing in, tightening its grip with each passing day. It whispers to me, promising power, knowledge beyond anything I have ever imagined. But I know it is a lie, a trap to ensnare my soul. Asterisk. Asterisk, I only hope that by burying this knowledge, I can spare Margaret from the fate that awaits me. But I fear it may be too late. The darkness has already taken root, and it will not rest until it has consumed everything. Asterisk. Asterisk, if you are reading this, then the darkness has won, and the secrets beneath the floorboards are now yours to bear. Asterisk. May God have mercy on your soul. Emily stared at the words, her mind racing with fear and confusion. The darkness, the thing that Edward had warned her grandmother about, was it still here? Had it been waiting all this time, hidden beneath the floorboards, biding its time until someone uncovered the truth? The house seemed to close in around her, the shadows growing deeper, the air growing thick with a sense of impending doom. The tapping had stopped, leaving an oppressive silence in its wake, as if the house itself was holding its breath, waiting for her next move. Emily knew she should leave, that she should run as far and as fast as she could. But something held her back, a force she couldn't name, a pull she couldn't resist. The secrets beneath the floorboards were hers now, and there was no turning back. Emily spent the next few days poring over the journal, trying to make sense of the strange symbols, the cryptic entries that hinted at dark rituals and forbidden knowledge. The more she read, the more she felt the weight of the mystery pressing down on her, the sense that she was being drawn into something far beyond her understanding. The house seemed to change as she delved deeper into the journal, the shadows growing darker, the air growing colder, the sense of unease growing stronger with each passing day. The tapping had stopped, but the silence it left behind was even more unnerving, a constant reminder of the secrets buried beneath the floorboards. She tried to ignore it, to focus on the task at hand, but the weight of the mystery pressed down on her, refusing to be ignored. The journal hinted at dark forces, at entities that existed beyond the veil of reality, and the more she read, the more she felt their presence in the house, the sense that they were watching her, waiting. The nights were the worst. The house seemed to come alive after dark, the shadows stretching and shifting in the corners of her vision, the air growing thick with a sense of impending doom. She could feel the darkness closing in, tightening its grip with each passing day, and she knew that she was running out of time. The final entry in the journal haunted her, its words echoing in her mind as she tried to sleep, as she went about her daily routine. The darkness had found her, just as it had found Edward, and there was no escape. She had to do something. She had to find a way to stop it, to protect herself from the fate that awaited her. But the more she searched, the more hopeless it seemed. The journal was filled with cryptic references, with symbols and rituals that made no sense to her. The darkness was too strong, too powerful, and she was just one woman, alone in a house filled with secrets. The nights grew longer, the shadows growing deeper, the sense of impending doom growing stronger with each passing day. The darkness was closing in, and she knew that it was only a matter of time before it consumed her, just as it had consumed Edward. But then, in a moment of clarity, she realized what she had to do. The darkness was drawn to the secrets beneath the floorboards, to the knowledge that Edward had hidden away. If she could destroy it, if she could erase the knowledge, she might be able to stop the darkness, to break its hold on the house. She spent the next few days gathering the materials she would need, following the instructions in the journal as best she could. It was a desperate plan, a last-ditch effort to save herself from the fate that awaited her, but it was all she had left. On the final night, as the shadows stretched long and deep, as the air grew thick with the presence of the darkness, she lit the candles, placed the journal in the center of the circle, and began the ritual. The air grew heavy, the shadows closing in around her, the sense of impending doom pressing down on her like a weight. But she kept going, reciting the words from the journal, focusing all her energy on the task at hand. The darkness seemed to scream in protest, the house shaking with the force of its rage. But she kept going, her voice growing stronger, her resolve hardening as she fought back against the darkness. And then, with a final, deafening roar, the darkness was gone. The house was silent, the air clear, the shadows retreating as the first light of dawn broke through the windows. Emily stood in the center of the circle, the remnants of the journal smoldering at her feet, her body trembling with exhaustion and relief. She had done it. She had destroyed the secrets beneath the floorboards, had broken the hold of the darkness. She was free, but as she looked around the house, at the shadows that still lingered in the corners of her vision, she couldn't shake the feeling that the darkness was still there, lurking just beneath the surface, waiting for the right moment to return. The secrets beneath the floorboards were gone, but the house would never be the same, and neither would she. If you enjoyed our story, subscribe to our channel and turn on notifications.